B is for Bert.
How do we learn a language?
Almost everything we learn about language, we learn long before we get to school. We just learn it in the home. So by the time you get to school and people start yelling at you for doing grammar wrong, it's too late. You already learned how to speak the dialect you're going to speak for pretty much the rest of your life. Most people's language doesn't really change too much after early childhood.
If we learn language before we really learn the grammatical rules of it, does that mean that grammar is just made up? Like Bob Jones in 1712 just decided, no, that's a comma, not a semicolon there.
So honestly, sometimes that is exactly what happened. So a really good example of this was Daniel Webster. He was trying to make a kind of more Americanized version of English for Americans. So he instituted a lot of spelling reforms. He instituted a lot of vocabulary suggestions, and people really tried to impose that on children in school. And sometimes it works, but for the most part, it doesn't, because language isn't something that you can manage from the top down. It's something that it's a complex adaptive system. It's like the economy or something. It's something that, it emerges from all these conversations and interactions people have.
How much does how our brains work dictate language? Like, for whatever reason, our brains just want languages organized this way.
This is one of the very fundamental debates in linguistics. There are kind of two camps in linguistics. One is called the generativist camp, and they're the ones that think that there is a core part of grammar that is actually genetically inherited. And then there's the functionalists, which is a camp that I sit in, and we see that language is something that is shaped by all of the different cognitive skills that we have going on at once. So it's shaped by our ability to read people's intentions, our ability to have, a complex hierarchical representation of ideas, limitations on cognition. Also the fact that, like, when you're talking about something, you have to talk about something in time. And so you tend to have to put the topic first. So about 60% of the world's languages follow a subject, object, verb, word order. So you would say, like, the dog the man bit would be the equivalent of in English of the dog bit the man. But English doesn't do that. English is subject, verb, object. So English is a minority pattern. And so the question is, why 60% of the world's languages? Why not all of them?
So many languages are organized a different way.
What unfortunately a lot of people think, though, is that we do all share exactly the same way of speaking. And the fact is that language is incredibly diverse. Like, this notion of like standard English is really kind of a myth. Nobody actually speaks standard English. Everybody speaks a dialect. If you give people a map of the United States or whatever country, and you say, draw the dialect areas, they'll draw a bunch of different regions and they'll label them. And there'll always be one region that they label that they wind up calling normal or average or standard. And sure enough, it'll be the region that they're from.
I never really thought about that languages are organized and set up differently. To me, the difference in languages was just the words. One said dog and another said perro. I didn't think that they fundamentally worked differently.
Oh, incredibly so. I mean, there's so much diversity in the world's languages. I'll just give you like a tiny hint of some of the differences. So one of my favorites is in Navajo. There are 13 different verbs for any action having to do with handling an object, or an object being put or placed somewhere, or giving or taking an object, depending on the shape and size of the object. So if I wanted to say that this pen is sitting there, I would say siti. But if I wanted to say that this piece of paper is sitting here, I would say siltsos. And if I wanted to say that this kind of roundish thing is sitting here, I would say se'ah.
How does something like that happen? Because to me, on the surface, I don't know if that's inefficient or brilliant.
Right. So the fact is that language isn't really logical. It really has nothing to do with kind of what's, quote, efficient, except that people are always trying to make language more efficient. Sometimes it's just kind of random, like what occurs in one language versus another.
Do we know what was the first language?
No, and that is, as a matter of fact, that was such a controversial question that the French Academy banned all discussion of the origins of language for about 100 years because people would get into such bickering fights about it in academia. We have a better and better idea today. We still don't know the time frame. It could be anywhere from like 100,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago that it evolved, and we can't reconstruct that far back in history. We can reconstruct older languages based on present ones. We can literally look at modern day languages, compare them, and using evidence from those languages, wind the clock back and figure out what earlier versions of these languages used to look like without having any written record of them. And we can confirm this because if you take like Italian and Spanish and French and compare them and do this process, use these techniques we have, and you wind the clock back and you reconstruct what earlier language they all seem to come from, you reconstruct Latin. And then, of course, we have lots of documents in Latin, and we can confirm that that works. So, but we can only do that back to like the farthest back we've really been able to do that with certainty is probably in the order of like 6, maybe 8,000 years. So if language evolved 40 or 100,000 years ago, there's no way we're getting to it.
What would be the farthest back we can get?
The farthest back we can get is what's called Proto-Indo-European. So Proto-Indo-European was this group of languages that evolved probably in the Caucasus or around Anatolia, somewhere in kind of Eastern Europe, but there's some debate about that. And they spread and evolved into the Indo-Aryan languages in India. And so that includes Hindi. And then it evolved into and also Sanskrit over in India. And then in Europe, it evolved into the Celtic languages. So that's going to be modern Irish and some of the like the Gaelic languages in France before the Romans took over. And then it also evolved into Latin and Greek. So English and Hindi are related. They're all part of this huge family of languages called Indo-European. It's like 200 some languages at least, that all descend from this one proto-language, and it's just branched out and spread out over time.
Are there any holdovers from that? Like we call a book because...
We call a book because it originally, so it's related to the word beach. There's this common process, a sound change process in the world's languages where a K sound will become like a ch sound or a sh sound. It's called palatalization. And so originally it was related to the word beach because books were made from beech trees. And so those two words go all the way back, I believe, all the way to the Proto-Indo-European word for beech tree, I believe.
Do certain words seem to change less than others over time? Because I would imagine that every language would have a word for fire.
Well, it's interesting you say that because there is this notion of core vocabulary that is more resistant to change. And for a while, it was really speculative. But they recently did some great work actually figuring out, like looking at a bunch of languages and which words were least likely to change over time. And we now have that list. And sure enough, fire is on it. One of those kind of core words is fire. Out of the words, I believe, like mom and milk and water, like land, earth, I think are other good examples of that.
Looking back at it, are you surprised that we have so many languages, or are you surprised that we don't have more?
It's more because if you think about it, like this would have started as just like one community, like maybe one nomadic tribe and probably the reason they were successful is because they were one of the first communities to get horse technology. And we know, like we can reconstruct words for like cart and horse all the way back to Proto-Indo-European. And also other things like we know we can reconstruct the word for bee, like honeybees in particular. And at the time, honeybees were not spread around the world. And so that helped us pinpoint exactly where we think the Indo-Europeans came from. But so, yeah, they would have just been one community that was very successful and started spreading over time. The other thing that amazes me, so if you look at biological species, there are a lot of parallels between biological species and languages. And with biological species, the majority of the species on the planet that have ever lived are now extinct. They're gone. It's like 90% of all the species on the planet are gone. So throughout history, all the way back to the dinosaurs and whatnot. And language is kind of like that too, except that all of the languages we have today descended from original languages and things. But specifically in terms of the vocabulary, if you can take like one word from Indo-European, like if you took the word for one, there are, I think in the case of one, there's at least maybe 100 words in English that originally derived from the word for one. So, for example, the word a and an, that used to be one. You used to say like, I saw one man, but you didn't pronounce it one at the time. At the time it was pronounced on man. And eventually the N started dropping out before consonants, so it became a man. That's just one example. The word 11, the word 11 literally meant one left over. So it was originally it was on Leoven. And the Leoven is related to our word for left, to leave over, or leave behind. And the on in front of it was originally one. So there's like, I think about 100 words at least that come from just this one Proto-Indo-European root in English. And so you're thinking like, why does it seem like everything just goes back to this one word? Well, it's because a lot of the vocabulary that used to exist in these languages has fallen out of use. And so just this tiny proportion of Proto-Indo-European now accounts for all of the vocabulary of all of these hundreds of languages. It's like this was the successful vocabulary in a sense that kind of made it through history.
Is there any kind of a time frame where, generally speaking, after 100 years or 500 years, this language will be completely different, where I wouldn't even recognize English?
If you go back to Old English, it's unrecognizable. The Lord's Prayer in Old English sounds like "Fader uer thuthe out and helfenum." Like no one understands that. It's totally different. Old English had all sorts of cool like suffixes and prefixes that we don't have anymore. You used to have like 10 different forms of every noun, depending on whether it was the subject or the object or the indirect object, and we lost all that. So it's like totally changed. There was this one linguist, Morris Swadesh, who was very famous, and he had that exact same question. And he thought that you could kind of time how long it took languages to evolve and how far back languages separated from each other by comparing their core vocabulary. And so this is called glottochronology, and it's totally kind of debunked now. It turns out you can't really do that. So like if you look at Icelandic grammar hasn't really changed much in the past 1,000 years. The pronunciation definitely has, but like a lot of the grammatical constructions are pretty much the same. Whereas English has been through all sorts of contact with other people and borrowing and things. So English has completely changed. It looks nothing like it did 1,000 years ago. So the pace of change for these two languages is totally different. All of the top most frequent words in English are Germanic origin, but the top 1,000 most frequent words of English, most of them are actually from French or Latin because we've borrowed those words. So it's kind of interesting that the core vocabulary has stayed like true to English origins, true to the Germanic origins of English. And then everything else has been all those borrowings. So 60% of English vocabulary is from French or Latin.
So how do new languages get created? Is it just as simple as one group goes over a mountain and they start calling a cat Gato?
Yep, and that's pretty accurate.
But then how does it become a completely different language?
Yeah, so oftentimes it's not even so much about changing the words for things, although that obviously is a big factor. But the things that people really have a lot of trouble with over time wind up being sound changes. So cat and gato is a great example. So those two words are related to each other. If you think about a K sound, like and I know we spell it with a C, but it's a K sound for cat. And you think about a G sound for gato, both of those sounds are pronounced in the same part of your throat. It's in the back of your throat there in the velar. Yeah,
I can actually feel it in the same place now that I think about it.
And the only difference between those, like we were talking about earlier, is the whether your vocal folds are vibrating. And so what happened is in Spanish, speakers just started, for some reason or another, vibrating the vocal folds for that consonant. And it probably just started as like a subtle variation. Some people just kind of did it as like a slight accent thing, and it just kind of drifted. Like a lot of languages just kind of random drift in that direction. And then, other times there'll be like reasons and pressures for it. So in a lot of languages, if you have a voiceless sound, like a T between two vowels, it will become voiced. So like in Spanish, the ending ado, A-D-O, so like, hablado, spoken. That D, I believe, was originally a T, and then it became voiced because it was sitting between two vowels. So sometimes there are pressures Like if you're voicing your vocal folds on either side of a sound, there's more pressure for that sound to also be voiced in the middle too, and you can understand like why that would happen. But sometimes it's just kind of random. There's this great thing in English that's called the Great Vowel Shift. It's quite the adventure English went on. And if you turn your head and you imagine, I'm going to keep speaking this way to the extent that I can. If you turn your head and you imagine like a side profile of your face, right? Where you pronounce the vowels depends on where your tongue is in the mouth. So you can kind of picture this kind of like sort of trapezoidal area in the mouth where you would pronounce different sounds, right? So English started slowly shifting where we pronounced vowels in the mouth. So the word book, for example, used to be boke, and that's why we spell it to this day with two O's. But over time, that vowel shifted and your tongue started moving up in the mouth and was book instead. Or sorry, no, that one actually centered. So, what was interesting is when these vowels changed, they started moving into the space of other vowels. And so those vowels had to move. And so this is what's called the change shift. All of these vowels, like all of the vowels in English, where we pronounce them in the mouth, just kind of rotated. And this is called the Great Vowel Shift. And the really like pretty, I don't know, I think it's kind of hilarious thing about this is this happened right after English spelling kind of got standardized. So the printing press comes in the 1400s. We start printing books. Printers start having standard spellings for words for maybe the first time ever. They start standardizing this stuff. And then the Great Vowel Shift happens and screws it all up.
So is that why we seem to say so many words differently than how they are actually spelled?
Right. Yeah. Other languages have a much clearer correspondence between the letter and the sound. But English, and it's not arbitrary in English, but there's just a lot more complexity in English to that correspondence.
What were the main vowels that shifted? Can you give me some examples of the big shifts that happened?
So English vowels used to be pronounced like they were spelled. So book was boke and feet was fate. And so actually, here's a good example. So foot and feet. The reason why we have a weird plural for some of those nouns is because English used to have, like I was talking about, different endings on nouns to indicate what a noun was doing in the sentence, so whether it was the subject of the sentence or the object, whatever. And sometimes that ending on the noun would be like an E sound. And that ending on the noun would start affecting the sounds before it. So the plural of foot used to be faute, but it was foti with that E at the end of it. And speakers started kind of anticipating that E, and it started affecting that vowel before it. So it became feti. But then over time, those endings dropped out, and you were left with that vowel change. So what was originally faute became fate, and that became feet. And once the Great Vowel Shift happened.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
Hardest language to learn, easiest language to learn.
Yeah, I'll give the disappointing answer. It really depends on the language you already speak. If you speak an Indo-European language and you want to learn another Indo-European language, it's a lot easier than if you speak an Indo-European language and you want to learn Navajo. But there's one important principle that all linguists really abide by, which is that no language is really any more complex or simple than others. Like certain features of languages can be more complex, but they're usually balanced out by simplicity in other areas.
Are there examples you can think of where a language just doesn't have a word for something?
Oh, sure. All the time. The important thing to kind of realize with that, though, is it doesn't really matter. So a lot of languages don't have distinct words for green and blue. Does that mean that those speakers can't understand the difference between green and blue? No, of course they can. And as a matter of fact, Russian has separate words for light blue and dark blue. But does that mean that Russian that English speakers can't understand the difference between light blue and dark blue? Of course we can. Russian speakers might be able to understand it a little bit more quickly and might be able to pick up on those color distinctions a little more efficiently than English speakers because they've got a lot of practice at it. But it doesn't constrain your ability to think about a thing a certain way. What
is the most unique language? Are there languages out there that are just totally different than anything else?
Almost every week I encounter something in language that I did not think was possible. or just is unique and remarkable and diverse about language. So one that kind of recently really struck me was when I was working on my dissertation, and my dissertation talks about Nuchanoth, that language in the Pacific Northwest. And this language has an entire set of like hundreds of suffixes. And these suffixes aren't like a plural suffix or like a present tense suffix or anything like that. These suffixes are what would be like full words in English. So you would add a suffix, like there's a suffix for to. So you would say like, have the stem man, and then you would put the suffix for to on the end of it, like the number two. And then you would turn it into a verb, you'd add a verb suffix. And so it would literally be a verb meaning to be two men.
Is there an age where you can't learn a new language?
Okay, so it becomes a lot harder after puberty. It's called they talk about the critical period. Yeah, so if you don't learn your first language, whether that's, sign language or spoken language, if you don't learn your first language before you hit puberty, while you're in that critical period, you're probably going to never learn language. And there are cases of this, unfortunately. There are very unfortunate cases where you might have children who were deaf, and so the parents didn't realize that they weren't getting any language input, and they weren't learning until it was like too late, and so they were very delayed in their language acquisition. There's cases of feral children. So maybe this isn't an example of a feral child, but there's this really unfortunate case of a girl named Jeannie who was basically locked in a room by her father until she was a teenager. And when she finally got out, she was never really able to learn language. She was very, very emotionally expressive, and people could tell like just how tuned in emotionally she was, but she could never pick up language after that. And there's a famous case of they called him the wild boy of Avignon, I believe, in France. He was found in 1799, and he'd been living in the woods by himself up until he was like 13, and he never learned language either. But if you have exposure when you're young, then you can learn language throughout the rest of your life. And it is a little harder after puberty to learn languages as an adult. But recent research is actually suggesting that it's not as impossible as previously maybe people have thought. So people used to think like, oh, once you're an adult, you'll never learn a language as well as you do when you're a child. And for the most part, that's true. But the reason might not be because we're like cognitively incapable of it. It seems like the reason is really just more a matter of time.
Right. It's not that you can't learn it. It's just that you have so many things going on. Going on to the next one. What's your favorite curse word? I probably go with cunt myself, just because I feel like it's one of the curse words that still has a good bit of oomph behind it. Oh, that is true.
Like you can throw in fuck casually. Fuck's been around since like forever, like 1400. Like we have documentation on fuck going way, way, way back. And that's such a fun word because it gets used as nouns and verbs and adjectives. Like you can do whatever you fucking want to do with fuck. Like it's a great word. But it's undergone what we call semantic bleaching. It basically no longer has that same kind of pragmatic oomph that it used to. So that one is just like, if you're gonna really curse and you want to curse to actually like have a little bit of that shock value, I think cunt's the way to go.
You're right. If I'm in public and I hear somebody say the F word, I don't bat an eye. But if I hear somebody say the C word that I can't even get myself to say, I know that something is going on. Like, oh, there's something happening there. Favorite word in any language?
The words that really interest me are the ones that have like just illustrate the beautiful complexity of the language that they're being spoken in. So the language I work the most with is a language called Chitimacha, and it's the one spoken in Louisiana. It's a Native American language. And there's, I know this seems strange, but there's a lot of words that are whole verbs, but they get used as a noun. So it's the word for bridge. The word for bridge in Chitimacha is they usually cross it. And it's this whole verbal construction. It's got habitual suffix in there. It's got a plural suffix. It's got an intransitive suffix to tell you that it's like a verb that only has one actor, and it's got an instrumental on it to say that, it's like you're doing it with the bridge. So all these things like packed into this one word but it doesn't mean that like nobody uses it to mean cross. They use it to mean bridge. And this is something that happens in a lot of languages. Like in Navajo, the word for chair is literally you sit up there on it. Or like in Cayuga, the word for horse is it hauls logs. And so recently, these have become some of my kind of favorite examples of words in Native American languages that, they're verbs. They're actually verbs, but people have come to use them as nouns, and they no longer even realize that they started as verbs a lot of times.
What is a misconception about language that bothers you?
When people have attitudes and ideas about language, it's never about the language itself. There's never any linguistic basis to these ideas, these attitudes. It's always about some preconceived notion they have about the people that they see as speaking that way. So, and for a lot of people, you will let something slide with groups that you have no issue with, and you will raise it as being ungrammatical or non-standard for other groups. So a question I get asked on TikTok all the time is, why do Black people say ax instead of ask? So this is a really revealing question because, first off, it's not the case that just Black people say this. That's a very common feature of a lot of white dialects as well. So they're like, especially in Southern English, you'll hear people say ax all the time. So the real question is, why, when you hear that way of pronouncing it coming from a white person, do you kind of let that slide and not think twice about it? But when you hear a Black person saying it, suddenly you're like, ooh, that sounds ungrammatical.
Right. You can't be okay with y'all, YA''LL, and be against ax.
Great example. Yeah. Well, and of course, the thing is, from a linguistic perspective, like y'all and ax are both perfectly grammatical constructions. As a matter of fact, the pronunciation ax has been around in English for as long as the pronunciation ask has been. There used to be all sorts of variation in the spelling between those two up until I think like the 1800s. And at that point, people started standardizing the spelling on ask, but the pronunciation never went away. It's just that spelling got standardized. So those two pronunciations have been around for ages. Y'all is the reason y'all came about is because remember that plural you became singular. And so we needed new ways of talking about plural you. And so English, depending on your dialect, developed like 6 different ways of saying plural you. You guys, y'all, yins, youans. It's something that a lot of people don't think about. Like language kind of winds up being one of the last bastions of acceptable discrimination. A lot of people that are out there, really being advocates for social justice and like being anti-discrimination will nonetheless like judge people very harshly on the way they speak, even though linguistically there's no basis for that. Y'all is just as good of a plural pronoun as you guys is. It's just that one dialect has more prestige associated with it than another. Linguistically, they're the same. Every dialect is as rule governed and as well structured and regular as any other.